This morning, an unsettling stillness settled over Moscow's industrial belt. By midday, it was no longer rumor. Something had broken deep inside the Russian economy. Entire factories, once symbols of the nation's resilience, fell silent within hours. The first reports came from Zelenograd and Lyubertsy, where workers arrived at dawn only to find locked gates and hastily printed notices announcing temporary production suspension. Inside sources from the Ministry of Industry confirmed that the shutdowns were not isolated. "It's coordinated," one official admitted under condition of anonymity. "They're cutting costs across the board. There's no money left." Within minutes, the scale became clear. Thousands of layoffs spanning metallurgy, machine building, and automotive sectors. The pillars of Moscow's industrial might were crumbling. Officially, the explanation was simple: logistical disruptions, global market instability. But behind those sterile phrases lies a more uncomfortable truth. According to documents obtained by our correspondents, state orders have dropped to their lowest level in a decade. Factories dependent on government contracts, especially those linked to defense production, have seen funding frozen since late summer. Managers were told to optimize personnel immediately. That meant mass dismissals without warning, severance, or public explanation. "We came to work and the machines were off," one machinist said. "They told us to go home." No one knows if we'll ever be called back. Social media channels filled with images of deserted shop floors and workers gathering near administrative buildings, demanding answers. Yet the tone was not chaos. It was exhaustion. "They promised stability," wrote one user. But stability for whom? For years, the Kremlin had portrayed the industrial workforce as the heart of the nation, disciplined, loyal, unshakably patriotic. But something has shifted. That loyalty, experts warn, is now fraying. "These people were the state's last reliable base," said one economist. "If they turn, the system itself begins to crack." Meanwhile, local authorities scrambled to contain the situation. Regional governors issued identical statements about restructuring processes and short-term adaptation. None addressed the human cost. Behind the scenes, factory administrators received strict instructions: no press comments, no public meetings, and above all, no mention of layoffs in connection with state contracts. But employees have already begun sharing internal memos that tell a different story. Documents referring to critical fiscal shortages and central funding withdrawal. For the first time, even lower-level officials are whispering what they've long feared: Moscow can no longer afford its own promises. By midday, employment offices in the capital's industrial districts were overwhelmed. Lines stretched outside in the cold, faces blank, voices low. People weren't shouting, they were calculating: rent, food, debts, families. "It feels like the 90s, an older worker murmured, "only quieter." Yet that quiet is deceptive. Beneath it, something heavier is forming. Not panic, but bitterness. In a system built on obedience, bitterness spreads faster than fear. For those watching closely, the significance of today's events goes far beyond economics. This isn't just a downturn, it's a fracture: social, political, psychological. The Kremlin may try to contain it with speeches and subsidies, but sources within the financial ministries already admit privately that there are no reserves left for illusion. And as one insider told us bluntly, when the machines stop, people start talking. What they say next, and how the state chooses to answer, will determine whether today's layoffs remain an economic story or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because in Moscow's factories this afternoon, silence isn't compliance anymore. It's the sound of something ending. By midday, the pattern had become impossible to disguise. One factory after another began announcing temporary downtime, though insiders quickly confirmed the euphemism meant permanent closure. In the southeast industrial zone, workers from a major heavy machinery plant were told they would receive retraining opportunities, a familiar phrase that, in bureaucratic language, means unemployment. At the same time, regional television channels repeated nearly identical reports about strategic realignments. It was clear the narrative had been written centrally, but outside the official script, the mood was darker. Videos began circulating from Elektrostal, Kolomna, and Podolsk, showing uniformed guards blocking entrances while managers avoided eye contact with their own employees. "They told us to wait for instructions," said one welder. "We've been waiting all year." Behind the scenes, panic spread through administrative offices. Internal messages reviewed by our correspondents reveal confusion and desperation. In one email chain from a state holding company, a mid-level executive wrote, "We can't pay wages beyond next week." The ministry has stopped transferring funds. Another replied simply, "Then tell them to pray." According to a source within the Ministry of Finance, the reason is brutally simple. The state budget has reached its limits. They tried to cover everything: war, subsidies, salaries, the source explained. Now, the math doesn't work. The result? The most extensive wave of layoffs since the early 2000s, concentrated in the country's industrial heart. For years, factory workers were the regime's most loyal constituency, disciplined, patriotic, sustained by a belief that their labor served something greater. But that belief is collapsing. Many of those losing their jobs today are the same people once featured in state documentaries about modern Russian industry. They were the faces of resilience. Now they are being erased. "We worked through sanctions, shortages, everything," one woman from a chemical plant near Moscow said. "And now they throw us out like scrap metal." That bitterness, experts note, is politically dangerous because it comes not from activists, but from citizens who once formed the backbone of state stability. Official channels insist the situation is under control, but the language of control itself has begun to sound hollow. Regional governors are forbidden to use the term crisis in public. Instead, they speak of adjustment and optimization. Yet inside those same offices, staff whisper about the possibility of protests: small, spontaneous, unorganized, but real. According to an internal police memo, local security forces have been instructed to monitor gatherings of dismissed personnel and prevent emotional escalation. That phrase, emotional escalation, reveals more than it hides. The authorities understand what's coming, but they no longer know how to prevent it. Meanwhile, social media channels once dedicated to factory news have turned into spaces of collective anger. Posts that begin with questions about severance quickly shift into open condemnation. "They told us to be patient," one message read. "We were. Now they tell us to disappear." The tone isn't revolutionary, it's weary. But weariness, as one analyst pointed out, is more corrosive than outrage. "You can suppress a protest," he said. "You can't suppress despair." And despair, multiplied by thousands of families, becomes something that no police unit can contain. Inside the Kremlin, the response has been predictable: deflect and delay. Officials speak of foreign pressure, market turbulence, and temporary adjustments to the industrial framework. But sources close to the economic bloc admit the truth: Moscow's industrial machine has entered free fall. "They can't admit the extent of it," one insider said, "because the moment they do, they lose their last argument: control." And that is what makes these layoffs more than an economic story. They are a test of loyalty, a mirror showing the limits of fear as a governing tool. For 2 decades, fear kept order. But as workers pack up their lockers and turn away from the factory gates, something else is rising in its place. A quiet certainty that the promises are gone and that obedience no longer guarantees survival. By early afternoon, that certainty had already begun to spread, not through slogans, not through leaders, but through whispers shared between shifts, in markets, on buses. "They can't fire all of us," someone said. It wasn't defiance, not yet, but it was the beginning of a thought that, once spoken aloud, no state can ever fully erase. By early afternoon, the tone in Moscow's industrial districts had shifted from disbelief to something colder: awareness. The shock of losing jobs gave way to calculation, quiet, methodical. In the cafeterias of shuttered plants, men who had spent decades operating heavy machinery now sat over tea, discussing politics for the first time in years. Not the abstract kind, but personal politics: who was responsible, who lied, who benefited. "They said we were the backbone of the nation," one mechanic told an independent reporter. "Now they've broken our spine." His words, bitter and calm, captured what many began to feel: a final rupture of faith between the worker and the state. At first, local authorities tried to stage a show of stability. Television crews were sent to record re-skilling seminars, supposedly offering new opportunities for laid-off employees. But in reality, the rooms were empty. "It's theater," said a factory foreman who attended one session. "They film us listening to speeches, then turn off the lights." The deception was so blatant it backfired. Instead of reassurance, it deepened resentment. For years, the Kremlin's control depended on 2 things: loyalty and illusion. Now both were failing, one quietly feeding the other's collapse. Sources inside the Ministry of Labor describe an internal panic. Reports of heightened social agitation have begun circulating through government channels. One internal briefing, obtained by our correspondents, warns of incipient collective activity among dismissed workers. The wording is careful: but the fear behind it is unmistakable. For the first time in over a decade, the Kremlin sees a risk not from intellectual opposition, but from its own industrial base. These are not activists or students. These are men and women with families, debts, and long memories of broken promises. Once they lose trust, one political scientist noted, you can't rebuild it, you can only repress it, and repression costs money they no longer have. But it is not just trust that is disappearing, it's the idea of endurance itself. Throughout years of crisis, Moscow's factories remained symbols of stoicism, a belief that no matter how hard things became, production would continue. That belief was part of the social contract. You work, the state protects. Now, with the machines silent and wages unpaid, the myth has collapsed. And in that vacuum, a dangerous clarity emerges, that the system's strength was never stability, only fear disguised as pride. Once fear weakens, the disguise falls away. Still, the government continues to speak in its familiar tone of forced optimism. A spokesperson from the Ministry of Industry declared that new investment programs would soon revive production. But according to banking insiders, those programs exist only on paper. Several state corporations are already defaulting on internal debts. They're buying time with language, said one economist, but the words are losing value, just like the ruble. Indeed, financial analysts quietly confirm that industrial loan defaults have surged in the past week, a fact not yet reported publicly. Meanwhile, workers have begun creating small, informal networks, not unions, not yet protests, but groups for mutual support. They share information, food, and sometimes anger. We can't rely on them anymore, said a welder in Balashika. So we rely on each other. That sentiment, solidarity born from neglect, may prove more subversive than any organized movement. For decades, the state cultivated isolation, one worker against another, one region competing with the next. Now that isolation is eroding, replaced by quiet unity. They thought we were asleep, another worker said. We were just tired. Now we're awake. By the end of the working day, the industrial silence of Moscow had taken on a different sound, not absence, but tension. Reports surfaced that several mid-level managers had refused to enforce further layoffs, fearing unrest. A few resigned rather than face their own workers. It's starting from below, said a source inside a large engineering firm. The first cracks aren't in the streets, they're in the offices. And those cracks are widening. According to insiders, the Kremlin's biggest fear is not protest, but paralysis. A slow, silent stoppage of will. A moment when people stop pretending the system still works. That moment, by several accounts, is approaching. One official described it in striking terms. It feels like we're walking on glass, and we can hear it starting to break. For those following this story, that sound, faint, fragile, but real, is the beginning of what experts call a legitimacy collapse. It doesn't announce itself with marches or slogans. It starts quietly, in lunchrooms and hallways, when people realize that nothing holds except the habit of obedience. And once that habit fades, even power itself begins to lose its gravity. The next hours, insiders warn, would show whether that gravity could still pull Moscow back, or whether the country had already begun to drift beyond control. Inside the ministries, the realization has finally begun to take hold. What Moscow faces now is not a production crisis, but a loyalty crisis. According to several officials present at a confidential briefing, the mood inside the government this afternoon was grim. The meeting, chaired by a senior deputy prime minister, focused on a single question: how to stabilize the industrial psyche. The phrase itself sounded surreal, but it revealed a truth that no one dared state aloud. The workers were no longer afraid. They're quiet, but it's not submission, said one participant afterward. It's distance. They've disconnected. In a system built entirely on the illusion of unity, disconnection is fatal. Across Moscow, that quiet detachment now hums beneath the surface of daily life. Cafes once filled with factory employees are half empty. At metro stations near industrial zones, leaflets promising new state programs are ignored. On paper, nothing looks extraordinary. Trains still run, the city still functions, but those who watch closely describe a shift in energy. It's like the air is heavier, said one sociologist. Everyone is working slower, speaking softer. It's exhaustion mixed with clarity. When people stop shouting and start thinking, the state's most powerful weapon, fear, begins to lose its shape. Meanwhile, inside the factories that remain open, tension is spreading like an invisible gas. Supervisors are cautious, managers avoid the shop floor, and ordinary workers trade glances instead of words. No one trusts anyone, a foreman in Mitishchi confessed. We're all waiting for something, but we don't know what. That waiting, experts say, is precisely what the Kremlin fears, because waiting is not passive, it's preparation. The longer people remain in uncertainty, the more they begin to notice the cracks in the structure they once considered unbreakable. According to documents seen by our correspondents, the presidential administration has launched an internal task force to monitor worker sentiment. Dozens of sociologists, analysts, and media specialists are now being instructed to collect real-time data from Telegram channels, job forums, and private chats. But even those involved admit the futility of the effort. You can track complaints, one researcher said. You can't track silence. Silence, in today's Russia, has become the most dangerous signal of all. It no longer means fear, it means withdrawal. And withdrawal, multiplied across thousands, becomes a kind of collective strike of the soul. Yet amid the anxiety, another shift is occurring, inside the power structure itself. Several insiders confirm that regional officials, once unquestioningly loyal, have begun quietly expressing doubts about Moscow's competence. They're scared to say it openly, said one political consultant, but in private they ask the same question as everyone else. How long can this continue? Some governors have already requested emergency funds to prevent unrest in factory towns. The requests, according to sources in the finance ministry, were denied. There's nothing to give, one official said. They're protecting the illusion of stability by dismantling what's left of it. At the same time, a quiet rebellion is brewing within the bureaucracy. Mid-level administrators, overwhelmed and underpaid, are leaking data to journalists and analysts. Financial summaries, internal memos, even police reports, information that once stayed locked behind sealed doors is now slipping into public view. It's not treason, said a former state employee. It's confession. For years, these officials enforced the illusion. Now, faced with its collapse, they're seeking absolution through exposure. And yet, the Kremlin continues to speak in the same ritualistic phrases. Temporary fluctuations, adaptive policies, renewed industrial balance. The words no longer connect with reality. The state is talking to itself, in a language the country has stopped hearing. Even state media has begun to hesitate, its tone less triumphant, more defensive, as if waiting for direction. They don't know what story to tell, said one editor at a pro-government channel. And when power loses its story, it loses its purpose. By this hour, Moscow remains deceptively calm. Traffic flows, lights glow, official statements continue. But beneath the calm lies a tremor, the feeling that something irreversible has already happened. People no longer expect the state to fix their problems, they expect it to fail. And that expectation, spreading quietly through factories and ministries alike, is the most dangerous transformation of all. What began as layoffs is turning into something deeper, a slow unraveling of faith, a recognition that the machinery of the state, like the factories themselves, can grind to a halt. The next moment, insiders warn, will come not from the streets, but from the very center of power, where the silence now feels heavier than any protest. And when it breaks, it may not be the workers who move first. By early afternoon, the silence in Moscow had turned into something larger, not fear, not chaos, but the collective understanding that the system had crossed a line it could no longer step back from. Inside the capital, factories that once pulsed with noise now stood as hollow monuments to promises unkept. Workers gathered in small groups outside the closed gates, not shouting, not pleading, just standing. The wind carried their conversations, brief, cautious, but clear. They think we'll wait, one man said quietly. We're done waiting. The words spread through telegram channels faster than any official statement, carried not by activists or journalists, but by ordinary people finally speaking to each other without fear. In government circles, that tone of calm defiance caused more panic than any protest. Emergency meetings were called in the presidential administration, where economic advisors argued with political strategists over the next move. We can't buy them off anymore, one advisor reportedly said. The treasury is dry. But another voice, quieter and colder, cut through the room. Then we use fear again. Those 6 words hung in the air, not as strategy, but as confession, because even fear, once effective, was losing its grip. You can frighten people into silence, but not into belief. And belief, as insiders admit, is the currency that's run out first. Meanwhile, the public performance of stability continues. On state television, news anchors speak of strategic transitions and domestic renewal. But the faces on screen no longer match the words. Their voices carry a tremor, a faint hesitation between lines. as if even they no longer trust the script. In the streets, the contrast is sharper. Billboards promoting national unity stand beside shuttered factories, their slogans fading under the weight of reality. "They keep talking about the future," said a worker from Tula, "but it's already behind us." Economists describe the current situation as structural fatigue, a phrase that sounds technical, but in truth, it means the system is tired of itself. The bureaucracy runs on autopilot, issuing decrees no one believes in. Managers falsify reports to preserve bonuses that will never come. Officials stage optimism while quietly transferring their savings abroad. Even among loyalists, conversations are now punctuated with doubt. "No one thinks this can last," a source in the energy sector told us. But no one knows what comes after. That uncertainty, heavy, silent, omnipresent, is the real crisis. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something new is forming. Workers who once depended entirely on state contracts are starting to build networks of mutual aid. Former engineers are sharing tools, machinists teaching each other how to repair and sell parts independently. It's not revolution, it's adaptation. And in Russia, adaptation is often the first step toward transformation. "We don't need them to lead us," said one dismissed foreman. "We just need them to get out of the way." The sentence, simple but final, captures a mood the Kremlin can neither suppress nor understand. Inside the walls of power, fear has begun to change shape. It's no longer about protests or sanctions, but about something far more dangerous: irrelevance. For decades, authority in Russia meant indispensability. Now, the people who built its foundations are learning they can survive without it. That realization, quiet but spreading, is the one truth the state cannot censor. "They don't believe in us anymore," a senior official reportedly admitted. And once belief goes, everything else follows. By the middle of the day, the city appeared unchanged. Traffic, news, routine. But to those paying attention, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Moscow no longer feels like a capital holding the country together. It feels like a center slowly hollowing out from within. The power still stands, but the conviction that sustains it is gone. For our viewers who follow these events closely, understand this: history does not always collapse with noise. Sometimes it dissolves in silence, in the spaces between official words, in the eyes of workers who no longer listen, in the hum of idle machines. That is where Russia finds itself today, balanced between obedience and awakening, its future written not in decrees, but in the quiet refusal to believe them. Stay with us, stay informed, and subscribe, because what ends in silence often begins again, louder than anyone expects.